As you may already know, my name's Clare Baker, and I'm a former clutterholic and borderline hoarder. I successfully cleared all my clutter over 20 years ago without the need for an expensive home visit, and I've been helping people around the world do exactly the same ever since, so that they too can know what it's like to live a completely clutter-free life forever. I like to share my life experiences both before and after I successfully cleared all my clutter, to help fellow clutterholics, hoarders, and their friends and family to understand some of the thoughts, feelings, and experiences that we have when we struggle with clutter. What I share is not intended to be a judgment or criticism of anyone I mention, although I fully understand and appreciate that some people may take it that way. There are at least three perspectives on the same experience: yours, mine, and the facts. I share my perspective on my experiences, which is my reflection from which I can share my learning with others who may have or have had similar experiences. Before I got married, one of my favourite films was Father of the Bride, starring Steve Martin and Diane Keaton. I used to tease my dad that when I got married, I could imagine him being like the Steve Martin character, a father who's struggling to accept his little girl is growing up and getting married, struggling to accept that he is no longer her number one man in her life. And rather than talking about his feelings to his daughter, he tries to take control of the wedding and obsesses over the cost of it. Steve Martin's character eventually gets arrested when his frustration boils over. That's when he finally realizes that his attempts to control and his constant complaining are making his daughter unhappy. And he finally realizes and accepts that his daughter's happiness is the most important thing. That's exactly how I imagined my father would be about my wedding when the time came. And it would be okay, because we would inevitably have our Steve Martin moment, just like the movie. Little did I know that our experience wouldn't have the Hollywood ending. My father knew my fiancé Keith was going to propose to me because Keith travelled to ask his permission about 6 weeks before he actually proposed to me. The actual proposal came on Boxing Day as Keith and I were in an airport lounge. We were waiting to board a plane to Luxor, Egypt for a 2-week holiday, with a plan to fly to the pyramids in Cairo to celebrate New Year's Eve. As I came out of the ladies' toilets at the airport and looked up at the departure board to see whether our flight was boarding, Keith told me to sit down. I didn't want to sit down, so Keith told me to sit down again in a much more forceful voice. Keith isn't a forceful kind of guy, so I did as he told me and sat down. And there, on a plastic seat outside the ladies' toilets in the South Terminal of Gatwick Airport, Keith proposed. He didn't get down on one knee, later claiming that the floor was too dirty. Neither did he have a ring, later claiming that it was so that I could choose my own. Yet despite the decidedly no-frills proposal, I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him, so I said yes immediately. To mark the occasion, we went to the pub in the terminal to celebrate, just the two of us. Keith had a pint of Guinness to steady his nerves, while I got on the phone to my parents and best friends, who all knew he was planning to propose. However, Keith had told them he was going to propose on New Year's Eve when we were at the pyramids. That probably would have been just as memorable in a different way. According to Keith, he was just too impatient to wait that long. For the remainder of our holiday, Keith and I talked about what we wanted for our wedding. Keith was 40, I was 32, and we are both social introverts who enjoy socialising, but only with close friends or small groups. As a result, we decided that we wanted a small, simple destination wedding abroad. So on our return from Egypt, we spoke to our travel agent friends about what we wanted. We wanted it in Egypt, which we both love. However, that wasn't going to be easy to organise, so they suggested Cyprus instead. We didn't know anything about Cyprus. So just 6 weeks after Egypt, we flew out to Paphos in Cyprus for a weekend trip to check it out. By the end of the weekend, we had the date, the church and the hotel booked for October the 30th the same year. All that was left to do was to invite everyone, for me to buy a dress and choose a couple of bridesmaids, for Keith to pick a best man, and for everyone to book their flights. Flowers we would do when we arrived in October, and the reception was all dependent on how many people decided to come, which we wouldn't know until nearer the time. When we got home from Cyprus, we met with both sets of parents over lunch to tell them all our plans. Given our ages, we planned to pay for it all ourselves. So we told our parents that they were welcome to contribute financially if they wanted to, but that it wasn't expected. All we wanted was for them to all be there, obviously. Keith's parents were excited for us, although a little nervous. They'd never been on a plane before, so this was going to be a whole new experience for them. Keith's mother wanted to pay for the venue for our engagement party the following month, and Keith's father wanted to pay for the honeymoon. My parents, however, had clearly assumed I would have a traditional UK wedding with family, friends, the extended family I rarely saw, their group of friends who I didn't know, and to be heavily involved with the decision-making. So they were shocked that we had already planned it all ourselves. They had also clearly imagined that they would pay, as was tradition, when they got married. Of course, when parents of the bride pay, that also assumes a certain level of input and control over the decision-making. This was particularly true in my family, where my parents paid for things which appeared generous, but in return they had some control over the decision. Keith and I had taken that power and control away from them by deciding to pay for our wedding ourselves. As a result of Keith and I having made our plans independently of my parents, they were very vague about what they wanted to contribute. My father wanted to see the detailed spreadsheet of the budget first. Although there were so many unknowns and variables, it was very vague. Consequently, my father became obsessed with the cost of the wedding, just like Steve Martin's character in the film. My father even pulled me aside at our engagement party to ask me some questions about the budget scenarios I had sent him. I had to point out that it was completely inappropriate to talk about it at our engagement party. Keith and I had taken financial and practical control away from them, which was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and forcing them to choose between their comfort and control zone or stepping into the learning and change zone. They wanted the former. It was the booking of the flights for the wedding that should have been my dad's Steve Martin moment, when he finally realised that his constant complaining and trying to take control was making me unhappy. That was when he should have finally realised and accepted that my happiness was more important than him trying to take control of our wedding. Sadly, it wasn't. Instead, it was when I realised that my dad considered what he wanted as more important than what I needed, the unconditional love, support and acceptance from a father I used to have a strong bond with, something I never had with my mother. Phil and Sarah, our travel agent friends, had booked everyone on the flight to Paphos except my parents and my brother. When they called my parents to find out what the delay was, all they got was resistance. Dad wanted us all to fly to a different airport because he could get cheaper flights using his BA shares. Luckily, Phil and Sarah were used to dealing with my dad and already had the facts that the transfer would cost from the other airport more than twice what he would save. They also knew that for some reason my parents wanted to put my brother in a different 3-star hotel down the road rather than in the 5-star hotel that the rest of us were staying in. So, in anticipation of this, Phil and Sarah negotiated a discount with the 5-star hotel so that my brother could stay in our hotel. Still, my dad wouldn't pull the trigger and book, but we didn't know why. Eventually, my father told Phil that he'd have to think about it and talk to me first. Sure enough, a couple of minutes later, my dad called me and, amongst other things, tried to convince me to change all our plans and fly to the different airport instead. As he continued to try to get some sense of control by trying to persuade me to change our plans to fit around his, I told him to stop. Dad, it's simple. We're getting married in Paphos and we're all booked to fly to Paphos. We are not going to fly to a different airport on the other side of the island. But of course, we don't all have to be on the same plane. So, if you want to fly to another airport, that's entirely up to you. All I need to know is that you've booked a flight to come to the wedding. And just so you know, if you're going to carry on being like this between now and the wedding, challenging and trying to control or influence every decision we make, you might want to think carefully about whether or not you really want to come. And that was when my attempt to force the Steve Martin moment backfired spectacularly. Having never had clear boundaries in our relationship before, when I finally communicated a clear, non-negotiable boundary over our wedding, the result was that it was interpreted as my having told them not to come, which in turn resulted in the silent treatment. They didn't call or try to communicate with us at all. Instead, a wall of silent indifference went up, and they tried to influence us through other people. First, they sent a letter to Keith's parents to try to get us to all meet up and discuss the wedding. As my father-in-law Frank so succinctly put it, in the letter, they were talking about you as if you were teenagers who had no money and weren't capable of making your own decisions. They even asked us to arrange a meeting between us all to discuss the wedding and agree who was going to pay for what. What is there to discuss? You've planned it and you're paying for it yourselves. Our job as parents is to simply accept that, respect that, and support you however you want. My mother started telling people that I had told them they weren't invited to the wedding and that I was mentally ill, like my brother. To add credibility to her claim, she told people I had been diagnosed by a family friend who was a psychiatrist and who I hadn't seen or spoken to for 10 years. They tried to get my brother to get us to contact them and apologise, but instead my brother called me concerned that he wouldn't be able to come. He was financially dependent on my parents, so because they decided they weren't going, that meant they weren't going to pay for him to go either. He became a pawn. I wasn't going to play that familiar financial control game, so I asked my brother a simple question. "Do you want to come?" I said. "Of course," was his answer. So I called up Phil and Sarah and booked him on the same flight and into the same hotel as the rest of us. Simon could no longer be controlled or manipulated by my parents as he had been so often in the past. Unable to use my brother to influence me, my dad then sent my cousin to try to get me to contact them and apologise for what I had said. She failed. And as a last resort, she told me that she had just been diagnosed with breast cancer and she didn't want to die knowing that my dad and I weren't talking. I hung up in disbelief that she would sink so low as to use her cancer to try to guilt-trip me into saying sorry to my dad for not letting him take control of our wedding. My father had no other choice but to make one final attempt to get me to contact him. So he emailed me, not called, to tell me that my uncle had explained to him that weddings are done differently these days, apparently. Something I had been saying to him for months and that he had chosen to ignore. He just couldn't admit to me that he had made a mistake and accept that we were in control. To him, the Steve Martin moment was a sign of weakness, and his perfectionist self couldn't allow that to happen. As a result, my father chose not to be at our wedding. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, my back, which has always been where my emotional stress went and continues to go, it got significantly worse. I had epidural injections privately every week for 6 weeks, each costing £1,000. I was wearing my back brace constantly and was using crutches as we boarded the plane to Cyprus. It was my physiotherapist who told me that the areas of my back that were in spasm represented a lack of emotional support, feeling unloved, a lack of financial support, and anger towards my parents. Clearly, my body was responding to my emotional state. On the wedding day, a combination of adrenaline, dopamine, painkillers, and a corseted dress enabled me to walk down the aisle, holding on to my brother, who gave me away in the absence of my father. At the small reception we had back at the hotel afterwards, I found my brother crying on the balcony. At first, he refused to tell me why he was so upset, worried that the truth would ruin our wedding. I told him that wasn't possible. He eventually told me that our parents had called him that morning trying to talk him out of attending. He was angry, so angry, because he knew he was being manipulated and used by my parents. It was a beautiful moment when everyone gave my brother a huge group hug to let him know we were all there to support him. The day after our wedding, I found out from Phil, Sarah, our best man, and his wife that they'd been on the phone to my dad 2 days before the wedding, pleading with him to get on a plane so that he could give me away. Phil and Sarah, the travel agents, had even put 2 seats on a plane on standby just for them so that they could be there. All my parents had to do was get to the airport. My father declined, saying that they didn't have suitable clothes or time to pack. When he was told that all that mattered was that he got on the plane so he could walk me down the aisle, he then said they had made other plans. He clearly wasn't going to admit his mistake and have a Steve Martin moment. Despite not having a Steve Martin moment, our wedding was how we wanted it. About us, for us, sharing with people who wanted to be there, full of love, laughter, joy, and making memories. I was able to relax and finally be my true self for the first time in my life, something I know I wouldn't have been able to do if my parents had actually been there. We had the support and love that we needed from those who were there. For me, getting married was the start of a new chapter in my life and the end of my parents featuring as main characters. The fact that the Steve Martin moment never came signalled to me that my dad had made a conscious decision not to be part of my life from that point on. The unconditional bond of love and trust that I had assumed was unbreakable had gone forever. Neither before or after our wedding has my dad admitted he made a mistake or tried to reach out to me to reconcile. Even in 2 family counselling sessions I initiated years later, my parents maintained that they did nothing wrong and it was all my fault. I wish my dad had loved me unconditionally and got on that plane to walk me down the aisle, something I'm sure that he had dreamt of since I was born. But I have to accept I will never get my Steve Martin moment. I never had and never will have a bond with my mother, but being rejected by my father on my wedding day hurt. Sadly, history repeated itself 7 years later when our dad tried to control my brother's wedding. I would experience it a second time 16 years later when he emailed me to tell me of my brother's death the day before. Sadly, my brother would only experience the confidence to put the same boundaries in place that I had over my wedding when he planned his own funeral in secret to ensure Dad didn't take control. I have learnt to accept that my dad's actions over our wedding were signs of his fear of facing, feeling, and processing uncomfortable events and emotions from his past, just as I had to face my own to successfully clear all my clutter. Ultimately, when you start prioritizing your own needs, wants, and feelings, other people can get uncomfortable. You need to decide whether you need them in your best life or to let go of them.